The crackdown in Syria is our top story this morning. Bashar al-Assad's efforts to retake Hama echoes a similar bid by his father to crush opposition in that city 30 years ago at a cost of 20,000 or more lives. Now, the death figures have nowhere near reached that level, but the question today is the UN statement condemning the violence any match for Assad's determination? With more, as ever, joined by our International Affairs editor, Douglas Herbert. Doug, UN Security Council, they couldn't agree on a resolution, so they've issued this statement instead. Total paralysis, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. You know, I think it's really, we have to make this very clear to our viewers that let's not confuse this with a UN Security Council resolution of the kind that we saw with Libya in 1973. This is a formal declaration, a formal statement. It carries no legally binding weight. And what it really represents is the inability of the Security Council's members, remember there are 15 members of which you have 5 permanent voting members, to come to any sort of consensus on this deal. And yet realizing that in the face of what is becoming a slaughter going on right before the eyes of the world community, they couldn't just sit there and say nothing. So this is a lowest common denominator statement, essentially calling on, and what does it essentially say? Well, okay, it calls on Bashar al-Assad to stop the violence, warns that those responsible for it, not necessarily saying Bashar al-Assad, just saying those responsible for it, very vaguely, will be held to account. It calls for utmost restraint by all sides. Now this, let me go out on a limb here, editorial limb, is perhaps the most wishy-washy part of the statement, and it represents basically the inability to reach that agreement, because calling on all sides, that brings the protesters into it. The implication there is that there's sort of a 50-50 balance here, that the protesters and the regime both should show restraint, and it almost feeds into the Syrian regime's official party line so far, which is that this uprising is down to foreign conspirators and armed terrorist groups, armed gangs essentially, who have been taking aim and targeting the Syrian army and Syrian security forces. So this is a resolution, a statement, excuse me, which is toothless and which is very unlikely to be heard by Bashar al-Assad, who, like you said in your introduction, has essentially now calculated that the world community is not going to do anything. I don't think it's a total coincidence that this coincided with the opening of Hosni Mubarak's trial yesterday in Egypt, where we saw those vivid pictures of the former paramount leader of the Arab world there on a stretcher in a metal cage. Assad is basically sending a strong signal that he is in control of his own country, his own destiny, and he is determined to take matters into his own hands.
So you say toothless. I mean, a lot of talk about UN hypocrisy as well, saying, you know, in Benghazi and Libya, what happened there, and yet over this, Hama, Syria, actually, what's the difference? But the UN reacting really differently.
Fascinating comparison, and yes, hypocrisy, if you want to call it that. What was in Benghazi? Remember, go back to March 19th. That was the first day in which the French and the British took to the skies with those first airstrikes. This was before NATO was on board. Why? Because Benghazi, this was to protect the civilian population at the time of Benghazi, a city under siege by Gaddafi's forces that the rebels were trying to hold. They wanted to prevent a slaughter of civilians. And yet, here is what we see right now in the case of Hama. You mentioned the 20,000 back in 1982 who were slaughtered by Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current Bashar al-Assad. We see the beginnings of the same sort of crackdown, the same sort of movement. And we just don't see the same response at all. There was a calculation, perhaps, that they could get it over with quickly in Libya. Libya has dragged on and on. Perhaps they're saying we just don't have the forces, we don't have the will, we won't be able to do the same in Syria.
And what about the actual situation in Syria itself? I mean, the actual Syrian media seem to kind of exist in this parallel universe, don't they?
Absolutely a parallel universe. We could actually show you what that parallel universe looks like. This is what you see there on the screen is the web page, the front page this morning of the Syrian Sana news agency, state-run news agency. It's scrolling down. That top story was on armed terrorists who fired on Syrian soldiers who were wounded, armed army troops, Syrian troops. And this feeds into the line that Syrians looking at state-run media have been fed from the very beginning, which is essentially that this is down to armed gangs, not protesters, not ordinary Syrians who are demonstrating for their own democracy, democratic aspirations, but literally people who are being targeted by these sort of vague armed terrorists. So it's a parallel universe, like you said, of reality. They're not getting the story we're getting here.
Fascinating to see. Doug Herbert, top story, with you at this time of day, every day, here on France 24.